There is a buzz about London, as about so many big cities. As well as draining you utterly as you battle through crowded tubes and buses and grimly negotiate the hubbub, it returns that lost energy to you. And London is enriched now with an increased cultural diversity and a sense that the city is going places.
Hello, and welcome to Spatial Delight, a podcast about the politics of space inspired by the life and work of geographer Doreen Massey. I'm your host, Agata Lisiak, Associate Professor of Migration Studies at Bard College Berlin. In our previous episode, we talked about geographical imaginations. In this one, we'll focus on cities. Well, one city in particular, Doreen Massey's adopted home of London. We'll discuss what makes London a world city, unpack its connections with some key places elsewhere, and examine how it continues to be shaped by various forms of colonialism and imperialism. We'll hear from a range of Londoners, as well as Professor Yasmin Gunaratnam, a sociologist at King's College London and Massey's former colleague at the Open University. But first, let me introduce my co-host for this episode, Dr. Emma Jackson. Emma is an urban sociologist and ethnographer at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's the author of a book titled Young Homeless People and Urban Space, Fixed in Mobility, and the creator of Bowling Together, a research project exploring leisure practices and urban change through the site of a London bowling alley. I traveled to London to meet with Emma on a very ordinary and yet special street. Hi, Emma. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Emma and I are at Kilburn Laundrette on Kilburn High Road, a North London street that is the commercial centre of Doreen Massey's old neighbourhood. This is where she did her laundry and her shopping and many other things. This is also where she felt inspired to think about the innumerable connections that bind local places to elsewhere in the world. It's an ordinary street in a multicultural metropolis. Let's hear from Emma what Massey wrote about it some 30 years ago in an essay titled A Global Sense of Place.
It is a pretty ordinary place, northwest of the centre of London. Under the railway bridge, the newspaper stand sells papers from every county of what my neighbours, many of whom come from there, still often call the Irish Free State. The postboxes down the high road and many an empty space on the wall are adorned with the letters IRA. Other available spaces are plastered this week with posters for a special meeting in remembrance, 10 years after the hunger strike. In two shops, I noticed this week's lottery ticket winners. In one, the name is Teresa Gleeson. In the other, Shuman Hassan. Thread your way through the often almost stationary traffic diagonally across the road from the newsstand, and there's a shop which, as long as I can remember, has displayed saris in the window. 4 life-sized models of Indian women and reams of cloth. On the door, a notice announces a forthcoming concert at Wembley Arena. Anand Milland presents Rekha live with Amir Khan, Salman Khan, Jahi Cholwa and Ravina Tandon. On another ad for the end of the month is written, all Hindus are cordially invited. In another newsagent's, I chat with the man who keeps it, a Muslim, unutterably depressed by events in the Gulf, silently chafing at having to sell the sun. Overhead, there is always at least one aeroplane. We seem to be on a flight path to Heathrow, and by the time they're over Kilburn, you can see them clearly enough to tell the airline, and wonder, as you struggle with your shopping, where they're coming from. Below, the reason the traffic is snarled up is in part because this is one of the major entrances to and escape routes from London, the road to Staples Corner and the beginning of the M1 to the north. This is just the beginnings of a sketch from immediate impressions, but a proper analysis could be done of the links between Kilburn and the world, and so it could for almost any place. Kilburn is a place for which I have a great affection. I have lived there many years. It certainly has a character of its own. But it is possible to feel all this without subscribing to any of the static and defensive, and in that sense reactionary, notions of place. First, while Kilburn may have a character of its own, it is absolutely not a seamless, coherent identity, a single sense of place which everyone shares. It could hardly be less so. People's routes through the place, their favourite haunts within it, the connections they make, physically or by phone or post, or in memory and imagination, between here and the rest of the world, vary enormously. If it is now recognised that people have multiple identities, then the same point can be made in relation to places. Moreover, such multiple identities can either be a source of richness or a source of conflict, or both.
We follow Doreen Massey's footsteps down Kilburn High Road. That street has changed since 1991. The Irish Times is still sold at the local newsstand, but there's no more graffiti expressing support for the IRA. Instead, we saw a call to Free Palestine written in black paint over the railway bridge.
We didn't spot any saris for sale, but we saw a few shops selling hijabs and abayas.
There's also a Polish store and a cool-looking tattoo studio.
None of the changes we saw seem accidental, but reflect migration patterns and transformations in London's economy.
It's like what John Allen said in our previous episode. When things change elsewhere, Kilburn changes.
Yeah, but the general feeling of cultural richness that Massey talks about is still palpable. And it's not just our impression. We spoke to some people on Kilburn High Road, and here's what they said about the street.
My name is Nathan Queeley Dennis, and I am an actor currently working at the Kiln Theatre in Kilburn. Knowing Kilburn, I've known of the Kiln Theatre for a very long time as an actor. Since I've been at drama school, I've been aware of it, but Kilburn as an area, I've not known much of it. I'm not from London, I'm from Birmingham, so I've not known a lot about Kilburn. I've seen it on the maps, I've seen it on the tube station maps and the overground stations and things, but I've never had a chance to actually be within the area.
And what are your first impressions of Kilburn High Road?
I really like it. I love coming to places that remind me of where I'm from and home, and the kind of cultural diversity. The fact you outside now, you've got a Greek restaurant, you've got Lebanese restaurants, you've got Thai, you've got a Nando's, you've got a pub that looks like it's been here since 1898, and then just that all mixed in with a really nice sense of community. Reminds me of where I grew up, and I always try to, when I'm living in London, I always try and live in areas or exist in areas of London that remind me of that, rather than the more, gentrified kind of areas that maybe don't feel like they have as much of a soul or a heart.
So Nathan feels that Kilburn is a welcoming place. That's also what we heard from Taylor.
So my name's Taylor. I usually come to Kilburn mainly because I study here at ICMP for music performance. And I'm currently in my second year, so I've been here around 2 years. But I've also got to know Kilburn a few years ago as well, when I was 16, just from visiting here a few times. And from my take on it, it seems to be quite a nice area, quite chilled out. There's a lot of really nice food places around as well. The people that I've met around the area have been really great as well. So it seems like a really nice kind of friendly, almost kind of vibrant area, I'd say.
This all sounds very inviting, and Massey's own account of Kilburn is very positive too, but she doesn't over-romanticise it. She admitted that there is indeed much to delight in, but she was also very aware of the tensions. Mahib, a long-term resident, is concerned by the recent transformations of the neighbourhood, especially around Kilburn Market where he works.
My name is Mahib. I've been living in this area for almost 42 years. And, the people changed, the atmosphere changed, Kilburn changed, unfortunately for much worse than before. And the Kilburn Kilburn market situation is worse than before. It's uncertain future. Some says the market will be demolished. Some people says they will be here. So we don't know when they gave us a short notice. We don't know where to put our stock, what to do in the future. The street, to be honest with you, unfortunately, every single day we see 1 or 2 incidents. Yes, crime is very high. The people are coming out of the bank, they are scared, That's in several occasions the money has been taken away. We knocked down the guy, with £500. This is the 3-4 incident happen in a single day. And the only biggest problem we've got, because they resurfaced the road, at the middle of the road there is a big bump. When the people are trying to cross the road, trying looking right and left to cross the road, they forget there is a hump in the middle of the road, and so many injuries happen here, just next to in front of the bus stop. And I contacted the Brent Council. I said this one is really, really bad, dangerous. But this is our situation. We are struggling to pay our rent, unfortunately, nowadays. And that's all I can say. Sorry if you're. I've been so negative, but I have to tell the truth.
Massey reminds us in her essay that places do not have single, unique identities. They are full of internal conflicts. As we heard from Mahib, these conflicts take on different forms, from issues of badly maintained roads to levels of crime and council plans for redevelopment. And they also include different expectations of the place. Let's hear from Dave, the owner of Giggling Angel, a lovely cafe in Kilburn.
Okay, I've been here for 11 months. My name is Dave. I haven't had a day off for 11 months. I love my shop. I'm trying very hard to make it a success. Kilburn is nice. It could be rough every now and again, but I do have lovely clientele. I've got students. There are lots of different cultures that are coming in. A lot of, you got the Arabs, you got the English, you got the Albanians, a lot of, a big mixture, plus the students. And the students, they're not just English, it could be from all over the world. It's a university called ICMP. And what else can I say about Kilburn? It's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, it's one of those areas, it's hard to get the money. Because in some areas you can charge a lot more. But here you have to sort of consider how much you can charge depending on what the area is really.
So we see various conflicting narratives here. Some people like that Kilburn hasn't become gentrified. They're pleased that the neighbourhood has kept its character and they appreciate its relative affordability. But for Dave, as a new business owner, this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the rent is affordable, but on the other, there's only so much he can charge his customers for a coffee. He has to work very hard to make ends meet.
For Sylvia, a customer we met in Dave's cafe, there were also challenges in inhabiting Kilburn, even though it was an area where she enjoyed hanging out. She emphasised how her experience was shaped by street harassment.
What I would say is that it's a bit dodgy, and I think if you're going around Kilburn, you need to be a bit careful about your pockets, and sometimes it's better to walk around with earphones because it happens mostly if you're a woman that people just call you out, and it's just even if you don't care, it's just not nice. But apart from that, I really like the food in here. It's really nice. There are lovely supermarkets and just really cheap as well. So you can go, also if you're a student, really good for you. And also the pub scene is really good. So good and bad, I'd say.
These gendered experiences of place resonate with Doreen Massey's observation that women's mobility is restricted in the city in 1,000 different ways, not only by capital, but also by men.
How we experience places, then, is powerfully influenced by many factors, such as race, citizenship, class, gender, and age. For Massey, Kilburn, and any other place for that matter, is never just one thing, but rather a meeting place of jostling, potentially conflicting trajectories. As she wrote, "It is, or ought to be, impossible even to begin thinking about Kilburn High Road without bringing into play half the world and a considerable amount of British imperialist history. And that, as she insisted, provokes in us a global sense of place."
In the passage Emma read out earlier, Massey talks about how the global shapes the local. But global-local relations are hardly a one-way top-down process. The local also shapes the global. The global is locally produced. Here is Massey speaking about it at London's Serpentine Gallery in 2006.
I think very often in political campaigning around globalization, we see the local as the kind of product of the global and the local as the victim of the global. You know, global forces coming into your region and smashing it up in various ways, causing the destruction of local communities, causing the closure of factories and all those kinds of things. And in many places that is absolutely true. In industrial towns in the north of England, that is the dominant thing that is going on. In many places in the global south, that is the dominant thing that is going on. But it seems to me if we generalise that story, we end up kind of letting the local off the hook. We're exonerating the local. Because the global isn't produced up there. It's not always somewhere else. It's not some kind of ethereal sphere that just exists nowhere. Globalization is produced in local places. And what I'm trying to argue for is a geography of the understanding of that. And London is one of the key places in which globalization is produced.
London, as Massey wrote in her book World City, has effects on the wider planet beyond it. There is a vast geography of dependencies, relations and effects that spreads out from here around the globe. We went to London Docklands to see this up close.
We're in Canary Wharf, in a small park between the skyscrapers. It's a bright April day at lunchtime. Lots of office workers are sitting around on AstroTurf, taking a break in the sun. You can also hear some construction noise, birdsong, fountains, and planes departing and landing at the nearby city airport. It feels very casual. And yet, the bank logos displayed on the surrounding buildings remind us that we're in the heart of one of the financial centres of the world.
This part of London has been instrumental to the British and global economy for centuries. The Docklands were first developed in the early 19th century by British slave traders and plantation owners. British colonialism led to a huge increase in traffic on the Thames. This led to overcrowding and theft at the existing wharfs. The rich felt that they were losing money and needed a more efficient system. Parliament backed the Docklands project as it was also central to British imperial interests. The name Canary Wharf comes from Britain's trade connection with the Canary Islands off the western coast of Africa. The Docklands were heavily bombed during the Second World War and never fully recovered from the damage. The ships got bigger and the Port of London relocated further down the Thames, closer to the sea.
In the 1980s, property developers recognized the potential of this working-class post-industrial area of London. As the finance sector grew globally, London's traditional financial district, the City, became too small for the needs of international banks and investment companies. So, the British government under Margaret Thatcher supported a plan to transform the Docklands into a global financial centre. Doreen Massey was involved in activist battles against this development, but years later she admitted that even the disputed skyscrapers and the maligned Canary Wharf give a thrill. Here's what she wrote.
It was with a kind of guilty delight that with a friend, a visitor from the north, I rode round and round some years ago on the Docklands light railway. With a day pass, you can treat it like a fun fair. Its tinny precariousness making it feel even more like a ride in a fairground, in and amongst the amazing concrete and glass. The ambiguities abound. I campaigned against this stuff. Yet even as we object, the very energy, The preposterousness of it all enthralls. This is a city it is very easy to celebrate.
It is easy to celebrate London, isn't it?
We certainly had a good time visiting the places that Massey wrote about. One of the appealing things about her work is that she always balances taking enjoyment in the city with a concern for the forms of inequality and social injustice that are at its core.
She thought of globalization as a project, not a historical inevitability, and she saw cities such as London as engines of this project. As we heard in Kilburn, London itself is affected by global forces, but that doesn't mean that all those forces have their origins in faraway places. In some cases, they're just a subway ride away.
London's imperialist and colonialist legacies are evident on the city streets, and they also reach behind closed doors, into our classrooms, living rooms, offices, shops and hospital wards. We reached out to Professor Yasmin Gunaratnam to discuss this in more detail.
Yasmin is a sociologist and professor of social justice at King's College London. She is the author of Death and the Migrant and co-author, with Emma Jackson and several other colleagues, of Go Home, The Politics of Immigration Controversies. Yasmin, welcome to Spatial Delight.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
For Doreen Massey, any place is always a meeting place. It's always connected to other places. And that's something that your book, Death and the Migrant, also captures in a powerful way. What can we learn about London and its links to elsewhere in the world if we start with the place of the hospital or the hospice?
Yeah, I think that question was really at the centre of Death and the Migrant. So that book took me a very, very long time to write. And I also wanted to write it in a different way, so not the sort of standard academic writing, so I had to do a lot of unlearning. But I think I was really thinking about London as a necropolis, so what happens when we look at other layers of a city. And for me, illness and death had been very much a part of my life, so I spent most of my 20s caring for my parents. I looked after my father for about 7.5 years, and just very practical things about how a city becomes very different when you've got someone in a wheelchair. So my eyes would be always going to where the drop curb was, what the terrain was like, those sorts of things. And then St. Christopher's Hospice came into my life when my mum was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I was just really interested in matters of hospitality, I think, and those have really taken up in different ways. But the hospice movement very much comes out of a history of migrants and hospitality. So the very early medieval hospices used to be on routes that pilgrims took, and they would give hospitality to pilgrims and those who were ill, and they often became places where pilgrims would die. And so I was really thinking about, why isn't anybody talking about this? So a lot of attention in terms of how many of the early studies and urban ethnographies were done were really taken up by young black men, a focus on young black men. So very, I think racialized in a way as being hyper-physical. And so there was this sort of ableism inherent in the ethnographic lens. And I really wanted to say, just hang on a moment, that there are really important matters of race and ethnicity and multicultural going on by the bedside and in the front room and in places which are really overlooked. And so what happens when we bring those matters back in and see the city in a different way? And so particularly when I started doing my work, I think of them, I sort of call them in my mind Generation Exodus. So this is Britain's post-war, post-World War II big cohort of migrants, which are often called the Windrush generation now in shorthand. So these were people who came over to Britain enabled by a change in the 1948 Immigration Act, which gave rights of residence, really, and rights to vote as well to people from independent Commonwealth countries and former colonies. And so my parents were kind of a later part of that, generation of people who were actively recruited, I should say, by Britain to fulfill, labour shortages. So there were lots of stories of what it was like to come here in the 60s, and late 50s. And these were stories about racism on the streets, racism in the buses, getting jobs, really blatant. And people were thinking about these on their deathbeds,
Massey asks some uncomfortable and important questions about London and London's relationship to elsewhere, particularly in terms of recruiting workers from the global south. And she argued that we can build a responsible politics of place beyond place that asks serious questions about the global impact of the local, a global ethics of the local place. So what, in your opinion, would taking responsibility for London's extractive relationships to other places look like?
That's such a big question. So I guess I'll sort of answer it in a lowercase register. But I also really love that quote, a place beyond place. And just coming back to it, I think, again, to Doreen's sort of analytic and her way of approaching things, it really holds this tension, I think, between an absolute fidelity to territory and, to place in that sense, but also that moving into what she would term as the relationality of space always being on the move. And so I really love that restless pacing that she does in her work between really respecting territory and the locatedness of place, but also recognising its entanglements. So one of Doreen's colleagues at the Open University, and who's now professor there, is Parvati Rangaram. And she did some work with colleagues on what she calls the perverse subsidy, of African workers, care workers, particularly doctors, to the UK. I think that global care chain really came up in terms of the pandemic and thinking about place beyond place, really. So I was reading a study of the very early statistics that came out, and deaths from COVID-19 among healthcare workers were predominantly those from racialised minorities. And this brought up questions about them being on the front line. So that's a military metaphor, but that really people from global majorities are often shock absorbers for people in the global north in lots of ways. And that was brought out very clearly in the pandemic. But I also think it's something that's continuing today. You walk into any city hospital, really, and it's predominantly, you can see the racialisation of the workforce.
Yasmin told us about a book, The Migrants' Paradox, which captures London's entanglement with other places. She was impressed by how the author, Susan Hall, visualises these connections.
And Suzanne does that so beautifully in that book, where she works with an artist to create these sort of world street maps. And they are absolutely stunning. So on a page, like at the top of the page, you have a street. And then out of it is laid horizontally across the page is a map of the world. And they draw threads from the street to, so where the shop owner was born is just comes out onto the map. And you can see this huge, rich multicultural, really, that she just makes present. And so there's that, and then also the politics of regeneration, which feels really important in thinking about what's happening in London at the moment and how it really affects these small shop owners. And so I think that study really manages to do that work that Doreen kind of set out in terms of thinking about place as being also unbounded.
We will talk about urban regeneration projects in our next episode, Cities for the Many, Not the Few. But before we move on, here's a Doreen Massey story that Yasmin kindly shared with us. It's from a conversation they had over dinner in Soho one night.
Doreen was saying, she just mentioned very casually that she never had a washing machine and never would want to own one because she saw the laundrette as being a key site in the history of working class communities. And it's out of all the discussion and the theory we had, I remember just really something just knocked me over with that, because that level of thinking through of your everyday life, and then, I can't imagine it was particularly convenient to be doing that, but it was that commitment to really thinking through what community is, what community she'd come from, and, seeing a hub of that in different spaces, I think. But it just struck me as being so much work, and that's typically Doreen.
We actually went to the laundrette on Kilburn High Road and did a bit of recording in there for this podcast.
Oh, great. And what was it like? Was there lots of people there, or?
There were quite a few people there.
And they still use coins, which was, I think, the only time in London on this trip I saw anybody use cash.
But that's part of why the laundrette's an inclusive place.
So, we leave this episode where we started, on Kilburn High Road. Doreen Massey was deeply attached to Kilburn as her home and as a place that inspired her thinking about globalization. The street had a special place in her life, but it's really just an ordinary street. Perhaps, listening to this episode, you recognized some elements that remind you of other places you know. And maybe you feel inspired to think about their global connections. That's a global sense of place in action. Thank you, Emma, for joining me on this adventure.
It was a delight.
In World City, Doreen Massey asks, what does London stand for? We'd love to hear your responses to her question. What does London mean to you? What are your experiences of the city? Does your London resemble the buzzy, draining, multicultural city Massey describes in the quote that opened this episode? Please use the form in the show notes to share your thoughts with us. To learn more about the things we discussed today, go to the podcast page at thesociologicalreview.org, where you'll find a list of resources. Today's episode was created by
Susan Stone,
Reese Cox,
Adele Martin,
José Sarmiento,
and me, Agata Lisiak. Spatial Delight is hosted by the Sociological Review Foundation and funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. Many thanks to my wonderful co-host Emma Jackson and our brilliant guest Yasmin Gunaratnam. To the people we met on Kilburn High Road, Nathan, Taylor, Muhib, Dave, and Sylvia, thank you for generously sharing your Kilburn experiences with us. Thank you for listening.